There are moments in geopolitics that don't just make headlines, they jolt the world system, expose the fractures beneath powerful nations, and reveal which leaders are quietly rewriting the rules. What unfolded in the United Arab Emirates this week was one of those moments, and almost nobody saw it coming. Prime Minister Mark Carney arrived in Abu Dhabi for what many assumed was a symbolic diplomatic stop, a routine gesture, a handshake, a press release. But what happened instead was extraordinary. Cameras chased him, reporters sprinted, photographers battled for angles. The country's most influential media treated him not like a visitor, but like a global statesman stepping onto the world stage with gravity and purpose. And then came the shockwaves. Carney didn't just tour the Grand Mosque. He didn't just hold conversations. He didn't just pose for ceremonial photos. Instead, he triggered a geopolitical earthquake, breaking a 42-year diplomatic freeze, signing an unprecedented investment protection deal, launching full-scale free trade negotiations, and opening the doors for billions in sovereign wealth to pour into Canada's critical sectors. The ripple effects, they're already shaking Washington, Ottawa, and every capital that thought Canada would simply remain a quiet middle power. Is this the birth of a new era for Canada? Is this Carney outmaneuvering Trump on the global chessboard? Or is this the moment Canada finally steps into the League of Nations, shaping the future rather than reacting to it? Tonight, we break down exactly what happened and why the world is paying attention. Carney's very first moments in the UAE told a story that no spokesperson needed to explain. As he approached the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque, one of the most photographed architectural marvels in the Middle East, the spectacle wasn't inside the building but outside it. The swarm of journalists wasn't staged. The frenzy wasn't manufactured. It was organic, rooted in genuine recognition of Carney's global stature. Reporters leaned over barriers. Camera operators sprinted, some nearly colliding in the rush to capture his entrance. The energy surrounding Carney conveyed something rarely associated with Canadian leaders, commanding international presence. This wasn't the polite, restrained welcome Canada typically receives abroad. This was the reception of a leader whose influence extends far beyond his borders. Why the excitement? Because the UAE understood what many in the West had underestimated. Carney isn't just another prime minister. He's a former Bank of Canada governor, Bank of England governor, and global heavyweight with deep experience in navigating financial shocks and geopolitical crises. His reputation preceded him. And while the cameras clicked, something far more strategic was unfolding behind the scenes. For 42 years, Canada and the UAE had no in-person bilateral meeting at the leader level. 4 decades of stagnation, 4 decades of dormant potential, 4 decades where Canada sat out one of the fastest-rising regions on Earth. That ended the moment Carney stepped off the plane. This was not a ceremonial visit. It was a meticulously calculated geopolitical re-entry. One that signaled to the world that Canada was done being passive, done being predictable, done being overshadowed by U.S. turbulence. As Carney walked through the mosque under the glare of global media, one thing was clear. Canada had entered the Middle Eastern stage with authority. Hours after the media chaos, Carney entered a meeting that would reshape Canada's international strategy for decades. And it started with a single handshake, the handshake that ended 42 years of diplomatic inertia. Carney and the president of the UAE finalized a foreign investment protection agreement, a legally binding framework that secures Emirati investments inside Canada with long-term stability and confidence. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't a photo op. This was structural, strategic, transformative. Why does it matter? Because the UAE's sovereign wealth funds control over $1 trillion in global assets, one of the world's most powerful investment engines. And for the first time, that capital can now flow into Canadian megaprojects. LNG terminals, critical minerals, port expansions, mining operations, AI, and tech infrastructure, aerospace and defense, manufacturing for decades. Canada struggled to attract sovereign wealth investments. The country was seen as stable but slow, reliable but dull, safe but unambitious. Not anymore. Carney cracked open a new era. Analysts called the agreement historic. Insiders called it a turning point. But the truth is even bigger. Carney didn't just revive a dormant relationship. He activated one of the richest capital streams on Earth and directed it straight into Canada's most strategic sectors. This wasn't diplomacy. This was economic engineering. And it was only step one. Shortly after the agreement became public, whispers began spreading through Abu Dhabi's financial networks. At first, they seemed like rumors, cautious, unofficial, unconfirmed. But by midday, those whispers had turned into headlines. UAE sovereign wealth funds were preparing to inject billions into Canada. This wasn't vague interest. This wasn't exploratory conversation. This was targeted, strategic capital aimed directly at the sectors shaping the next 50 years. Critical minerals used in EV batteries, energy infrastructure, LNG export capacity, aerospace, manufacturing, advanced engineering, defense-related sectors, large-scale agricultural exports. This wasn't small change. This was long-term, country-shaping investment, the kind that defines national trajectories. Why Canada? Why now? Because the UAE sees what many Canadians take for granted. Canada is one of the world's most resource-rich nations. It has advanced tech capacity, engineering expertise, political stability, and a prime geographic location. What it lacked was strong global leadership willing to activate those strengths. Carney changed that. And there's another dimension to this investment surge, one that Washington is watching nervously. For years, the U.S. assumed Canadian strategic sectors were automatically American. That assumption just died. The UAE is stepping into areas the U.S. once treated as untouchable. This is a geopolitical shift, one that reduces Canada's historic economic dependence on the U.S. and positions it as a more autonomous global player. The world sees it, markets see it, analysts see it, and now the funding is following. Critical minerals, port expansions, mining operations, AI and tech infrastructure, aerospace and defense manufacturing. For decades, Canada struggled to attract sovereign wealth investments. The country was seen as stable but slow, reliable but dull, safe but unambitious. Not anymore. Carney cracked open a new era. Analysts called the agreement historic. Insiders called it a turning point. But the truth is even bigger. Carney didn't just revive a dormant relationship. He activated one of the richest capital streams on Earth and directed it straight into Canada's most strategic sectors. This wasn't diplomacy. This was economic engineering. And it was only step one. The next announcement hit like a political thunderbolt. Canada and the UAE had entered full-scale free trade negotiations. This is not a routine step. Trade talks are complex, multi-year, and signal deep strategic alignment. They are commitments, not experiments. Why would Carney pursue this now? One word: Trump. With Donald Trump escalating tariffs, threatening trade retaliation, and turning the U.S. into an unpredictable economic partner, Canada faced a difficult truth. It could no longer rely on the U.S. as its primary, let alone its exclusive trading channel. Carney didn't wait for the crisis to worsen. He didn't wait for another tariff shock. He didn't wait for U.S. unpredictability to stabilize. He acted. These UAE trade negotiations aim to reduce tariffs, expand market access, cut regulatory barriers, open new markets for Canadian aerospace, mining, and engineering, connect Canadian agriculture to Middle Eastern and Asian supply chains, integrate Canada into the UAE's vast trade networks across Africa, Asia, and Europe. The UAE doesn't just bring money, it brings reach. It is a global connector, linking Canada to markets it has struggled to access for decades. This isn't Canada reacting to Trump. This is Canada outmaneuvering him. Where Trump builds walls, Carney builds corridors. Where Trump isolates, Carney links. Where Trump triggers volatility, Carney creates stability. This is strategy, cold, calculated, and forward-looking. Amid everything happening behind closed doors, one public moment revealed something deeper, something emotional, symbolic, and almost unprecedented. The UAE allowed Canadian media inside the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque during Carney's visit. According to diplomatic norms, this is extremely rare. The mosque is not used as a political stage. Even Carney's meeting with the UAE president was held behind closed doors. But here, cameras were invited in. Why? Because the UAE wanted the world to witness something: respect, trust, recognition. As Carney walked through the mosque discussing unity and global harmony, the real message wasn't in his words, it was in the media response. The frenzy intensified. Photographers pushed in, journalists raced for angles. The atmosphere wasn't polite acknowledgement. It was presidential. For decades, Canada appeared on the global stage as a middle power, respected but rarely spotlighted. What happened in the mosque changed that image. The UAE wasn't hosting a Canadian prime minister. It was hosting a global statesman. Diplomacy has rules, symbolism has power, and in the Middle East, respect is shown through access. By granting unprecedented media presence, the UAE announced to the region and the world that Canada was entering a new category. The gesture was simple. The meaning was monumental. Canada wasn't just being welcomed. Canada was being elevated. While media buzzed around the mosque, the real action was unfolding where cameras were not allowed. Carney participated in a chain of private, high-level meetings with the people who control hundreds of billions in sovereign assets and shape Middle Eastern geopolitical strategy. He met with leaders of massive wealth funds, the entities responsible for deploying the UAE's trillion-dollar capital. Then he attended a private dinner hosted by the UAE National Security Advisor, an extremely rare honor extended only to leaders of strategic importance. These discussions spanned energy security, critical infrastructure, advanced technology, and AI, regional stability, defense, cooperation, African and Asian strategic corridors. This is where the world's real alliances are formed. Not in press conferences, but in closed rooms. Jean Charest, former Quebec premier and seasoned global diplomat, said something striking. None of this gets done unless the Prime Minister leads. That wasn't flattery, it was fact. For decades, Canada lacked the leadership required to forge global economic networks. Carney closed that gap in a single week. These weren't conversations about short-term deals. These were about long-term alignment, where Canada fits in global capital flows, energy transitions, and emerging trade corridors from the Gulf to East Africa. Most Canadians will never see these rooms, but those rooms will shape Canada's future, and Carney was in every one of them. Experts analyzing this trip agree, this is Canada's clearest strategic pivot in years, and the timing couldn't be more critical. The world is fracturing into competing blocks. The US is volatile. Asia is rising. The Middle East is becoming a capital superpower. Canada can no longer rely on a single partner, especially one engulfed in trade wars and political turbulence. Trump's tariffs and erratic policies forced Canada into a harsh realization. Dependence on one market is a vulnerability, not a strength. Carney's strategy counters that vulnerability. The UAE sees Canada as a partner offering stability, advanced technology, defense capabilities, agricultural exports, critical minerals, energy reliability. Canada sees the UAE as a counterweight to US volatility, a gateway to Africa, Asia, and Europe. A massive capital source, a long-term geopolitical ally. Jean Charest captured the moment perfectly. There's a bigger world out there than just the United States. This is not Canada abandoning the US, this is Canada evolving beyond it. Diversification isn't a luxury, it's survival in a world where economic shocks hit without warning. Carney didn't wait for catastrophe, he built a shield against it. This isn't a reaction, it's a realignment. What unfolded in the UAE was not the choreography of polite diplomacy. It was the unveiling of a new geopolitical reality. One in which Canada steps out of its traditional role as a quiet middle power and begins shaping global direction. The UAE's willingness to pour enormous capital into Canada isn't charity. It's recognition. Recognition that Canada offers something rare in a volatile world: stability, predictability, expertise, and leadership. For decades, Canada believed its influence flowed automatically from its proximity to the United States. Trump's trade war shattered that illusion. Tariffs and threats exposed Canada's dependency. Carney's response was not defensive. It was proactive. He built alliances the US cannot interrupt. He opened corridors the US cannot control. He positioned Canada not as a follower in Washington's orbit, but as an independent force with its own global network. This trip didn't just secure deals. It redrew the mental map of Canada's future. Imagine a Canada whose aerospace sector is fed by Gulf investment, whose critical minerals drive global EV supply chains, whose ports link Middle Eastern, African, and Asian markets, whose energy exports bypass territorial bottlenecks, whose agriculture feeds regions across the Middle East. That future is no longer speculative. It has already begun. The UAE trip was not a chapter. It was the prologue to something larger, a Canadian strategy built on diversification, resilience, and geopolitical ambition. This moment matters because it reveals something Canadians rarely see in their foreign policy: intentional, calculated global strategy. Carney didn't go to the UAE for ceremony. He didn't travel for symbolic gestures. He went to position Canada for a future where global power isn't determined by military size or geography alone, but by investment flows, trade corridors, critical minerals, energy security, and strategic alliances that transcend old assumptions. For years, Canada operated as though being next to the United States was enough to ensure prosperity, enough to guarantee stability, enough to avoid looking outward. But the world has changed. Trump's trade war proved how fragile that reliance was. Tariffs, threats, and volatility revealed the cracks in Canada's economic foundations. Carney's UAE trip is the blueprint for a new model, a Canada that is globally integrated, a Canada that diversifies its alliances, a Canada that attracts large-scale capital from world powers beyond Washington, a Canada that sees opportunity not just in North America, but in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. This trip produced more than headlines, it produced structural change. A 42-year diplomatic freeze ended. Billions in investment were set in motion. Free trade negotiations began. Global media elevated Canada's role. Key security and economic networks were strengthened behind closed doors. Most importantly, the world saw a Canada that doesn't wait for permission. A Canada that doesn't wait for Washington. A Canada that doesn't wait for crises. A Canada that leads. This matters today because the world is unstable and nations that fail to adapt fall behind. Carney's actions show that Canada has chosen adaptation, chosen ambition, chosen strategy. This isn't just a diplomatic win. It's the first step in a geopolitical redefinition of Canada's place in the world. And it signals something unmistakable. Canada is no longer just playing defense. It's playing to win. This is red leaf politics, breaking down the stories that shape Canada's future long before they hit the mainstream. If this deep dive gave you a clearer view of the global chessboard, hit like so YouTube knows this content matters. Drop a comment telling us what you think Carney's next strategic move should be. Share this video with someone who still thinks Canada is a quiet middle power. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not for generic commentary, but for sharp, unapologetic political analysis that cuts through the noise and focuses on power, strategy, and truth. This is red leaf politics. Canada is changing, and we're here to document every step.